wideband Delphi method, which has been in vogue for about good 4-5 decades ago. Back in the days when we didn't have all the tools, the technologies, and all these kind of the collaborative tools that we have now, people used to have this kind of a wideband Delphi method. We'll go through each one of them in detail. And then we also have a work breakdown structure. So this actually is the kind of, again, we had a look at this. It is an example for the work breakdown structure is the planning poker, and also the story points that the agile development team would typically work in order to come up with the estimates. And then we also have the source lines of code, SLOC as what we call. So we used to have the kilo lines of code, and then there's so many other different types of methodologies in there, where they used the number of lines of code required to achieve a particular set of functionality. So that's where the function point, for example, is another way to actually arrive at the kind of size, and from there the effort, and using productivity, they will be arriving at the cost. And there's something called as a cosmic function point, and then COCOMO. COCOMO is a constructive cost model. So it's basically, again, based on the function point, but it actually has a little bit fairly more advanced features in terms of adding the cost and having different tables for each of the languages and productivity. And then we have got use case points, again, very popular method about a couple of decades ago. People were using UML and then use cases to arrive at the estimates. So again, there's a very good approach, pretty much like user story points that we use nowadays. We'll have a look at each of these in detail right now. So when we talk about wideband Delphi method, so it says Delhi, so it's actually Delphi method. So it's a mistake, sorry. So Delphi method is actually kind of an expert view of something. So people who you bring in the experts into a particular room, and then you ask them to have a look at each of these, and then they come up with their own estimate in terms of how much each of the particular functionality would size up. And based on that, they would say that their own subjectivity, their own experience add together, they actually put together a kind of estimate. I think this would take roughly 20 days. But as the next person would say, I would take about 10 days is what I think I would typically take. So they actually have this kind of an expert judgment, an expert opinion around the functionality. And then it goes on and on, and finally they arrive at a kind of an average figure, which actually is a consensus. I think the basic functionality is similar to that in terms of the basic concept of planning poker is similar to that. We'll go into that slightly later. And then in terms of the source lines of code, is basically computed. For example, I was talking about a situation where 20 years ago, I actually was working on some of the statistic project using SPSS, which is a software used to actually come up with statistical analysis of data. So then I wrote a program about 15,000 lines of code for doing a linear regression for applying a linear regression on a set of data. And you know what? The same set of data now using Python, you just need to write one line, just one line. Of course, you need to import the library into the code, into the library of the respective functions. And once you import it, all you need to write is just one line to call that function, and Python does everything. So you don't have, just imagine 15,000 lines of code in SPSS 20 years ago is actually equivalent to one line of code in Python. So this is actually kind of fairly, you can say, very, very high level, very, very arbitrary way of coming up with estimation. So it really depends on the language as well. For example, .NET would have 10 lines of code to achieve one functionality, whereas Java could have 20 lines or 5 lines to achieve the same functionality. So it really is dependent on the platform and the language and the specific aspect of the functionality that you're trying to develop. And that's where I think it's not really a good measure for coming up with the sizing or the effort to work on a particular website or a web application. And no one actually, interestingly enough, this unit of measure was actually arrived at when people used to write on cards. So they used to actually write programs on a card on what we now has called like floppy disk kind of a thing. And they used to insert these cards into the machine, the big, huge machines that IBM type machines, not the PCs, but huge machines of computers that would process these punched cards. So the lines of code were actually a kind of unit of measure which was used back in those days. How many? So on one card, you can only write one line or one particular call of that particular software. So I'm talking about COBOL, or for example, Fortran, or even before that, some of the very, very old ADA type of languages. So this was when back in those days, but now I don't think it's a really good unit of measure nor a good method to go with. And then of course, the other important thing is the work breakdown structure, WBS. I remember using this very widely in my previous roles in some of my organizations that I worked with about 15, 20 years ago. Still, I remember the Excel spreadsheets that we used to create in terms of the whole thing, how we can actually break it down into the specifics. So we used to actually have this kind of a bottom-up estimation. So we're talking about the work actually being done by the team, and the estimates also done by the team. So this is one of the bottom-up type of estimation methodologies, very popular, very widely used by a lot of development teams in about 15, 20, or even 12 years ago. And I think even still now it's used in some contexts of the user story points as well. So you actually talk about the detailing of the decomposition. So the decomposition of the product, you're trying to break the whole product and the complexity down into individual units. And that could actually be driven in terms of the modules or the features. You could actually try and do that. Like, for example, we were talking about the modules. We say you've got, in the context of the e-commerce website, the catalog of products itself could be one module. The administration or the CMS where you can use to upload or change the details of these products or items could be another module. A third module could be the shopping cart. A fourth module could be the payment processing. A fifth one could be, for example, the order processing. And the sixth one could be about communication, the notifications of emails and stuff like that. So you actually see that each of these could actually be broken down further into these separate modules based on the functionality. And then you can also try and break it down in terms of the components or interfaces, in terms of the architecture. For example, you can say that the payment processing could actually have an interface with a third-party provider, service provider, for example, WorldPay or Digital Pay or something like that, which actually does your processing of the payments on your behalf. So you don't have to store all the PCI related credit card information. So what you need to do is to now look at interfacing with the third-party providers. What kind of interfaces do we have? Do they have any kind of APIs that they exposed? And what kind of APIs do we need to actually invoke to achieve some certain functionality? How can we do the get set kind of methods? So all of these, technically speaking, you can try and work on these when you talk about the components and the interfaces. And then you can also look at the processes, the procedures. If it is involved, kind of a workflow, you can actually try and look at all the processes involved. What are the kind of workflows? What steps are at each stage? What are the breakdown scenarios and things like that? So again, you're trying to decompose. You're trying to actually break everything down into the details. So you're not really looking at the very high 30,000 feet overview. You're actually getting down. You're actually parasailing. You're using a parachute from that particular height to drop in and land on the ground. As you get to the ground, you're getting better and better view of the ground. If you look from that height, obviously everything looks hazy, everything looks tiny. So as you parasail and as you actually get down to with the parachute on the ground, you get better and better picture in terms of what is on the ground and a clearer picture. So exactly the same way you're talking about the work breakdown structure, giving you that kind of a clarity, that kind of a detailed view and understanding of what each of these parts are. And that's where we break it down to activities, tasks. So some of the examples of work breakdown structures could be the story point estimation, the planning poker, in the context of agile, as we discussed, very, very relevant. And we're going to discuss these in detail in the coming slides anyway, so you get a clear idea there. And then function points obviously is another measure that I have been working on before, very, very popular. Again, the first and foremost thing is you arrive at the size. Size is important. First, look at the size of how big, small, or medium it is. From there on, you look at what is the kind of effort involved, how much productivity you can apply, And thereon, you can actually arrive finally at the other aspects of schedule, and then finally the cost. So this is the order. So don't forget that whenever you talk about estimation, people jump into cost. Tell me how much time it would take. Tell me how much it would cost. These are good questions to ask, but you can't just start off there. You need to actually start somewhere else, and that is the size. Yeah, unless you understand the size of a particular piece of work, you cannot estimate how much time it would take, what is the kind of effort involved in, and how much time and what's the cost involved. So in this context, what you do with the function points is, I mean, there are a lot of tools that were available. In fact, we were using Excel spreadsheets to come up with this, and then there was later Cosmic FP is a tool again, which is kind of automated, which would give you the different views, the forms, and different kind of list views, and where you can enter details, and as you enter, it would actually give you the kind of numbers and finally the figures. So how you typically work about in the FP is, it's important just to know in terms of how function point works. As it says function, so it's about functionality. It's not the technical aspects of it. It's not the technology. It's not the database underlying or anything like that. But what you try and look at is the actual functionality that you can achieve or implement with that. So that's what we refer in the context of user experience or product development as CRUD. So that's CRUD, that is, either you can create something, or you can read or review something, you can update or modify or edit, and you can delete that. So for example, in the context of the e-commerce, mobile e-commerce website, you can have a CRUD type operation for an order. So you can create an order, you can read or review the order, you can update or modify the order, and then you can delete that order. But then there's some business rules there. You can't update or modify the order once it's checked out. So essentially what does that mean is, once you create an order, you checked out, you paid the amount, and then you gave the billing information, and then you actually say order created, then it can't be modified any further. But you can modify that before that. So what do you call that as? That's the cart. So you create another object called cart. So it's basically it's a placeholder for all the products, items. You can change everything there. You can actually add more number of the same item. You can delete the items. You can do whatever you want in that particular cart. And once you check that out and say that I'm going to purchase, and you say buy now, the payment goes through. So in which case that cart is no more a cart. That object called cart gets converted into the order. So you are creating an order then. And then once that order is created, it can review it, you can do all that kind of stuff. So all these business rules around how you were going to create the functionality, how you're going to achieve that functionality. And similarly, previously we used to have people should register to the site. You should be able to purchase anything, or you cannot even browse the catalog of a particular website unless you register. First you need to register to the website, and then you need to log in. So you need to log in, and only then can you actually see all the products, what products they have, and then you can kind of delve deeper, click on the product. It shows all the details, the price of the item, and then the description of the item, maybe the thumbnail or images of the item, reviews of the item, can only be seen only after you log in. So that's again some kind of business rule. So you're talking about creating a user there, right? So you're creating the user, you're basically updating the user details, your address or your billing information, and then you can delete a user if they no longer want to have the account with this particular website. So all of these kind of rules you're going to identify. You're going to actually create all these CRUDs for all the entities is what we call. And then what we do with FP is basically we do the analysis in terms of what is coming in terms of the input screens, the pages. So you enter the data. So you're selecting the different items and you're creating the cart. So that's basically the input screen there. So the form views, all the different kind of login, registration, all of these could be the input where the user enters the details. And the output screens are basically what would be shown on the screen, or what is basically something like a report that could come out of the data. So these are called output screens of pages. And then you come up with different database tables. What kind of database tables need to be created? Do they have to be recorded or updated, or do they have to be referred to? Just like make a query to the database and then get the information and work on that information. So all of these, we need to identify all the tables that are required for us to do that. And then within each table, how many records could be there? And for each record, so for example, item, when you add an item in the shopping cart, that creates a record in the cart object, right? So that item will have, again, quantity, item description, item ID, or whatever it is, all of these again for that. So it creates a record whenever you add an item into the catalog and you say add to the cart or add to the shop. So you create that, and then you click on that, it creates a record in the background, in the back end, and that is going to add more and more records to the cart. And if you have got like 5 items that you clicked on and added to the catalog, you need to have 5 records in the database. So all of these details are required to be analyzed, and then you come up with the final figure saying I've got, let's say, 10 input screens, I've got 5 output screens, and then I've got so many database tables and so on and so forth. So basically that's pretty much what an FP works with. And then FP also looks at the aspect of the specific language that you're using. You're using Java, or you're using .NET, or using Python, whichever language that you're proposing to use for development of this functionality. You need to also add that, because each one has got its own complexity factor. So they have got some tables that we would refer, and finally you've got some figure to actually say that this is the total effort that would be that total number of function points, 500 function points or whatever. So that's the basic concept of a function point, and you'll be interested to know that's the same kind of a concept is actually carried forward with the use case point, and finally even the story points. But of course the concept is slightly different. We're still talking about the functionality. We're still talking about the analysis in terms of this division of or decomposition, but then how you're going to arrive at that is slightly different, which is what we're going to look at.